I think something I just said I've never said before. And that's always a great moment, right? When you're in a dance and you suddenly realize, we've never been here before.
Welcome to Dropped In, a podcast about cultivating resilience through artistic practice. Hosts Paul Singh and Aaron Brando drop in with artists, activists, teachers, and improvising human beings to discuss the politics and poetics of somatic practice and purposeful embodiment in a world of ever-shifting obstacles.
Welcome to part 2 of an interview with Keith Hennessy, an award-winning performer, choreographer, teacher, and organizer, and artistic director of Circo Zero, a laboratory for live performance that plays with genre and expectation. Hennessy's work embodies a unique hybrid of performance art, music, visual and conceptual art, circus, and ritual.
Take a few seconds to remember the feeling of a task you completed this morning. The taste of your first drink, the feel of cloth sliding onto your skin as you dressed. And then shift forward to now, and name the task you're in as you're listening to this. Whether it's active or passive, how does the task land on you? And now shift again into your imagination and feel what it will be like later to eat, or to change your clothes again, wash your hands. You've moved from memory to possibility, from known to unknown, and now move further with us.
That's what I'm taking away as like advice to me as a leader in that's a white privileged dude who's trying to create access, trying to create, and has what you called, I love this term, this idea of like earned entitlement. I really want to sit with that and like see how I can continue being true to a dialectic where both are really important to me. Like what Paul is saying and what you're saying, like I want a contact dance where like I'm joining and I'm merging and I'm like, and there's a plumb line and there's like that kind of sort of marriage into the unknown of sorts. I want that. I mean, it's like that's what like does feed me on a level of like deep humanity of sorts. Mm-hmm. And I need to stay in integrity around these conversations and the access to power and the distribution of power and the voices that are being called into the spaces.
You know, it's interesting. I think when I'm imagining myself in a jam right now, I use contact improvisation as some kind of vehicle to erase our differences, because I'm finding this connective way of moving with the person that's usually based in soft and touch and flow, and something that's listening for what your needs are and comfortable. But in that, it's that erasure of the other things that make us us, because we're almost too afraid to bump, to jar, to make a mistake, to have a hard fall, when that's so part of everything that happens right outside of that room anyway. So why are you not examining it? So this is what I want to ask you next. We jokingly said there is such a strong dichotomy in you for being very provocative in your work, the way you ask people questions point blank in dance spaces and teaching spaces, but you also have this incredible teddy bear sense about you. I was looking at one of your old interviews where you're asking Nancy Stark Smith questions, and I was just like, listen to the tone of his voice. He's so calming and kind, and he can say really dirty, aggressive words, and it's just like, because you really are coming from a place of proximity. Like I could stand shoulder to shoulder with you while you were really interrogating me. That it's a really nice sense about you. So there's this dichotomy of provocateur and also teddy bear. So what I want to ask is, when you're taking these post-contact ideas and all these things you brought up into a teaching space or a dancing space, do you have any approach to dealing with unrest or disagreement or friction in the dancing, or even when you're living? Do you have any approaches for dealing with those?
Wow. Okay. Everything that gets said makes many other things happen. I mean, the first is that I had already mentioned the underscore, which is a way kind of invoking Nancy, and then you just said Nancy's name. So I think we should just pause and say, Nancy Stark Smith, we love you. Rest in peace, rest in power, rest in potential.
Yes.
And wow, it's very,
Yeah.
I'm just very moved to think of her and to think of her with you. And, you know, that interview where I was asked to interview her, instead I wrote this insane amount of political material, and I made this video that was absolutely impossible for her to respond to. And one of the amazing things about Nancy Stark Smith is that she, A, inspired me to do that, and then she dared to try in public to respond to it, even though it was impossible. And so much of what I asked her is not at all how she thinks of herself or her relationship to the dance, including, hey, Nancy, you're basically one of the leading queer dancers in the world. How do you see yourself as a queer? You know, like your, the way that you have been not just a practitioner of a dance form that is one of the few couple dance forms or duet dance forms ever made in the history of the universe that is not based in gender roles. But then you have not played a typical female role in much of your own dancing and organizing practices. / also have. Like, so just, it's something very beautiful about Nancy that she would bring that out of me and that she would welcome it. And I am someone who stood in tension with Nancy at many, many times over 30 years. And yet, as I've said to other people, there was never a year, not a single year that went by from the very first time that I published in CQ for over 25 years. Every single year, Nancy contacted me to say, what are you thinking about? What are you writing? Send me something, talk to me. Where do you disagree with me? Like, you know, I was like, inside CI 36, I was like, oh my God, this is just insane control fetishism and lack of politics and really ignoring the globalization of this, and the white supremacy here is driving me crazy, you know. And Nancy never walked away from a conversation, a question, anything. So that should be said if we're going to say Nancy's name in a podcast this soon after she's died. So thank you. Small piece about what Brando's calling dialectic. The only caution I would put there in terms of like how we think political philosophy in terms is that sometimes we say dialectic, but what we're trying to create is binaries, and then we forget that there are no binaries that are actually symmetrical. So in these two positions of talking about it's all flow or it's all violence, or however we might frame this dichotomy, is that there is a dominant, like in the asymmetry of those two things, there is a dominant thing, which is to speak about the flow, and that it's seen as disruptive to speak about something else. And so sometimes when I'm at my most provocative self, it's because I feel like I'm in a punching up situation. I'm not punching side by side. So I think that when we're thinking about, and especially this comes up around racism, right, is that part of white fragility that all white people are built, you know, it's like deeply embedded for us. And I could extend white fragility to middle class fragility. One of the things about it is that we are very quick to think, okay, yes, white supremacy, but now I don't just want to reverse it and be like all white people are bad as some kind of balancing point to it. But in fact, one of the things we learned from feminism is that, and anti-racism, is that if we allow that flip to happen, all white people suck, all white people are racist, all non-Indigenous people are settlers who are stealing the land. If we can sit with that and hear that and just wait for the space after that, then there's other kinds of intimacies and negotiations that we're able to sit through. We can't, people cannot hear or witness white people's positioning being normalized as the universal for their entire lives, and then speak out angrily against it and try to flip it entirely and be like, white people are actually stupid and the English language has no poetry and can't even make beauty. Like, we can't react the first time we hear that, or even the second or the 10th time. We actually have to allow that to happen so that some other things can happen. Like, we have to have a longer view on a situation.
Yeah.
So that's the only place where I would be like, the dialectic, rather than like, you know, where you've got the way dialectic functions, right, is that there's a thesis, the antithesis, and then you look for synthesis. It's like, we can't force that practice onto something that needs to be, in a sense, ritualized. Like we need to see this from a longer perspective, and we need to allow what looks like reverse racism, we need to allow that to happen so that some other things can happen. Yeah. And being in the white group that is like, that's reverse racism, is just not, it's not interesting and it's not generative.
Or imagining into being versus and being in the present. I don't know, take that where you want.
So good. Yeah, so clearly post is a really complicated and sometimes just further confusing term, right? And that the place that I probably use the term the most is post-hippie. And I think of the post in what has evolved as a meaning for postmodern for me. So what we see with a lot of what's contemporary, meaning now, is that the modern is still actually quite dominant. And so postmodern identifies, and I mean, postmodern in terms of dancing or referring to contact or anything is almost useless at this point. Like, I think that postmodern is now a historical term. Like, it has, we could say, oh, there was postmodern architecture, and it meant a fusion of styles and a this and a that, and it impacted what is now happening in architecture. We could say postmodern dance and go, that was a term that was useful for around 10 years to identify a certain kind of break with modern dance. But obviously, it still has plenty of roots in modern and modernism and did not get rid of modernism, you know? So for me, when I first started using the term post-contact, and you want to talk geeky, I went a long time of like, was there going to be a hyphen or a slash or one word? And I picked the slash on purpose because I wanted to feel like there was this break and yet also building continuity. And I was thinking post in terms of after, meaning something that follows, like what I'm calling post-contact couldn't exist without the history of contact improvisation and certain kinds of approaches to dancing and vocabularies of dancing and vocabularies of teaching and organizing that are all very unique to contact improv spaces. I mean, they're no longer unique, but because contact changed the world, right? Like when you know, I do a lot of my teaching in the quotes contemporary dance unquotes context. And this is a world that even when contact improv itself might seem out of favor or no longer cool, or, oh, that's too white hippie or something else, it's like you're in a space that's completely reshaped. Like, it's not the modern dancers who really pushed for the sitting in circles in a room to start a class and the processing of somatic material and extending the experimental notions of what body healing meets relaxed practices, and you know, the whole sort of released dancing body is very intertwined with contact, with the work that CQ uplifted for 30 years and the kinds of transdisciplinariness that CQ modeled, that has been heavily replicated in contemporary dance scenes. So for me, post-contact is saying, I'm looking for this way to fuck with contact, but at the same time seeing a deep root in it. And that's why it's like post following the slash, meaning a slash, a break. But at the same time recognizing this sort of problematic thing of like, there's no escaping the actual thing itself. And I think what happens with post-racism and post-feminism is that these are terms to say, we're looking to a different kind of moment that is no longer where feminism doesn't mean the same thing because now women can do this, or now there's enough people of color doing this, or and I think that for the people who wanted to trumpet a certain kind of post-racism, their marker became Obama being elected president. And it's just so either ignorant, like willful ignorance, or it's just, it's so cynical to think that a Black president within the context of our political system marks any kind of massive break with the afterlives of slavery, imperialism, and colonialism that shape everyday life in this country, including our electoral politics. At the same time, I think that we have a lack of words to talk about how things shift. Like, how has feminism shifted from the 80s to the 90s to the 2000s to the 2010s? Do you know what I mean? How are we thinking differently around race and colonization? Even how the person you quoted is thinking through futures, right? Like, a lot of the futurism that's going on right now, and it's literally happening everywhere. Like, people in Australia are talking Aboriginal futurisms. There's Polynesian futurisms, Arab and Gulf futurisms, Muslim futurisms. And all of these are building and indigenous futurisms, where people are talking through these things all over the place. One of the ways that people think through Afro and Black futurisms is the problems of the current moment prevent a lot of good thinking and practice from happening. So why don't we project ourselves into a fictional space where not only are the current problems not the dominating influence on our activity, but actually where the traditional or indigenous practices that predate this colonial problem are actually re-accessed to form a future. So that this, like an Afrofuturism would be a Black imagined space where a pre-colonial Africa is interacting with a technological now. So that new things could happen, literally at the level of the imagination. And so if that's a kind of grounding for futurism, then we're in it. Of course, I mean, the other thing that's beautiful about the quote is to be called out by indigenous people around the colonial logic that centers the apocalypse, right? And this is why, you have this quote, and I don't know who first did it because now so many people are using it and I don't know its source. But it is easier to imagine the end of the world than it is to imagine the end of capitalism, right? And we see that, like, a certain kind of millennial, and I mean from previous centuries, like certain kind of millennial thinking has very much shaped the American imagination. So we're a country where the notion of the rapture and the apocalypse are always built in. And then we have, we've just the apocalypse has just been heavily invested in culturally, Hollywood, everything. And it's such a problematic way to think. Like, I had a friend who started this meme years ago before we had memes, of Devoke the Apocalypse. And I remember making these stickers that said Devoke the Apocalypse that I put all over San Francisco. But how do we shift from thinking that there's a future crisis where everything breaks and renews without recognizing how many people are living a version of apocalypse and or post-apocalypse right now. And this is one of the things we get from indigenous people, right? Which is that their end of times, their end of history, their end of the world has already happened. So what world are they living in? And are they living in the same world that I'm living in? And what kind of can we share any imaginal space together? And can we, like, this is where I'm very interested in the whole notion of postcoloniality and the postcolonial. And again, that's a term where for some people, there's definitely resistance in indigenous communities all over the world with the term postcolonial, because they're like, when did the after happen? Like, we only know colonization and imperialism on the African continent. We only know like the afterlife of British colonialism in India, for example, in Pakistan, in Bangladesh. It's like, this is a never-ending process. Like, what are you talking about post-colonial? But in academic circles, the post-colonial was actually a space for thinking through a very particular moment, right? Which is that in the late 50s, early 60s, there was different versions of victory and or transition from colonial governments into a kind of post-colonial government. So, and we're talking about the creation of like half the states or more on the African continent. We're talking about the partitions of India, Bangladesh, Pakistan. We're talking about different movements all over the world that in a sense were the phase after the very explicitly colonial phase. And so post-colonial studies is the study of these processes and of the worlds that we have afterwards. But it is problematic to think that the post there suggests that there's a following to it. And I think that
or that something has been resolved.
Right, that there was a resolve, or that the colonial ended.
Yeah.
And people think of different ways to deal with that, right? By calling it neocolonialism.
Yes.
And then we enter, this problematic space of the decolonial right now. And as soon as someone who grew up in an assimilated or middle class or white supremacist context, for us to just use the word decolonial, we're already in a problematic space. So I don't think we should get too fixed on what it means to us, or that any kind of definition that I would deal with. But I think one of the things that we're looking at, and how I think that to bring it back to contact, how contact could be a decolonial practice, or in fact already is one, and we can see the impact of that over the last 45 years. We can see certain ways that that each of us who live in assimilated America, we've been colonized, right? Like our imaginations, our bodies, the way we think of gender, the way we think of violence, the way we think of peace is already super influenced by this colonial practice. We've embodied it, we've embedded it. And a lot of the political tactics that are and medicinal tactics, and I would put those together, political and medicinal tactics of contact improv that are embedded in the form, are very supportive of decoloniality, like of decolonization. Like, we took the hierarchical dance class and we made it a circle. Even though there is a little bit of fetishization of context leadership, we've also really democratized the notion of a form that is developed through community and not through its individuals. The effort to think of the body as some kind of sacred space / organic part of an ecological whole, it's like, that's quite compatible with contact, right? Like, that contact aligns itself with certain kinds of somatics and healing practices, where the vision is to dance for your whole life, where it doesn't matter if you have different kinds of abilities or disabilities, physical or cognitive, you could do this dance. These are very compatible with decolonial mindsets. So it's more that how do we, those of us who care about these things, how do we bring out those things? How do we highlight those things and give those things space to breathe? And then we could think about, is this a technology that's shareable
Right.
outside of the context where it functions in?
And how do we share it without assuming all kinds of powers and privileges? Like, how do we share it in a way that brings into that idea of holding these mutual sort of conditions?
Yeah.
Thanks so much. It's just a treat, and this could go on for many, many hours. I just have so much more that I want to share, and I also want to keep it ripe for more conversations with you.
Yeah.
The thing I'd love before we just end is just like to check in, I guess, to your body right now, and to like offer you just a like an open space to say anything that would give you a sense of relief or closure.
Thank you. I feel great. And I feel better than when we started. I'm happy. I think something I just said I've never said before. And that's always a great moment, right? When you're in a dance and you suddenly realize, we've never been here before. So that did just happen in the conversation. And I think one of the places that it happened was in me thinking about the decolonial potentials of contact. And when I went like this, for those of you who cannot see me and are just listening, my fingers are straight and I held my hands up at diagonals and I interlaced the fingers, pointing them in these sort of, making an X out of my hand. And at the point where my hand came together, I said, the political tactics and the medicinal tactics of the dance in relation to decoloniality. And that felt like new material and new possibility. So I'm happy for that. And I'm very grateful to have shared a moment of grief and praise about Nancy with you.
Yeah.
I haven't done it, even though this is weirdly to call this face to face. I am looking at you, and we did have this moment together.
Yeah.
Thank you so much for taking the time to be our provocative teddy bear, for enlightening us. And I think that couldn't have been a better compliment to try to help someone get to a place they haven't been before with the thing we're sharing. That is, I know that exact moment in a dance, and I know exactly what it does to me. So yeah, Brando's right. What a treat. Thank you so much.
I'm totally stealing this provocative teddy bear thing, though, just by the way. So I'm accepting that brand and going to run with it.